Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We will be hearing in just a moment from a fabulous trainer from GEMS, but you are here with us this afternoon with the National Center for Victims of Crime to learn more about learning to work with commercially sexually exploited and domestically trafficked youth. Today, we will learn from Jenaya Brown, who is the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, or GEMS, in New York City. But I just want to say that this is the second in a series of webinars that the National Center for Victims of Crime is putting on. We had our first webinar last month, and we'll have another one coming up in October. This webinar series has been generously funded by the Annie Casey Foundation, who's supporting our work to support all of you working in the field addressing sex trafficking and working with children. So today we are going to hear, without much further ado, from Jenaya Brown. And just before we start, and I turn it over to Jenaya, I want you to know that in probably the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there's a little Q&A box that you can type your question or questions to the trainer, to Jenaya, and we will make sure that we collect those and answer them. We have a couple of key times during this webinar that we will take questions and ask Jenaya to address them. And so please do type your questions there. If it's not answered right away, please know that, that it will be at a time throughout the webinar. And if you are having any technical issues, you can also type those questions there, and Sam Webster from the National Center for Victims of Crime will help you address those issues. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Jenaya and to learn more from her and to learn more about GEMS. So Jenaya, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all this afternoon to share a little bit more about GEMS and what we do here, and then also to kind of give you a little bit more information to work with the population in which we are all so dedicated to working with and servicing. First and foremost, I just wanted to do a little housekeeping a little bit. As Rebecca mentioned, we are going to have certain areas in which we open up questions so that we are able to answer them, and then we're not waiting to the end of the presentation to do so. Also, I wanted to kind of give a little bit, just kind of, I like to say, disclaimers about what's going on. We are Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, so of course we know girls and young women best. However, the information that I will be sharing today also deals with boys and transgender youth because they are also victims of the issue of commercial sexual exploitation and domestic trafficking as well. And then also I know that we have participants from all over the country today and all over the nation. So we're coming from suburban areas, rural areas, and urban areas alike. And I also want to say, although we are located here in New York City, that the same issues are occurring across the nation. We travel within the training department here and have recognized this issue to be the same but look a little differently. So once again, some of the foundational information that we'll go over today will address those concerns. So we'll kind of go into the presentation now. So GEMS, Girls Educational Mentoring Services. If you all are aware, and if many of you are aware of what GEMS are, welcome back. If those of you who are new to GEMS, I want to go over a little bit of what we do and who we are. We're the nation's largest organization that's providing direct services specifically for commercially sex-exploited girls and young women. We are the only organization in New York State designed to serve girls and young women experiencing CSEC as well as domestic sex trafficking. So we service girls and young women ages 12 through 24. We have various programs, and starting with direct services, of course. We have an intake program. We receive referrals from various perspectives, so from healthcare centers, other social service providers, word of mouth, residential facilities, child welfare, just various components. We have a court advocacy program, so it's a two-portion program. We have the ATI, the Alternative to Incarceration program, that we have court advocates in our in various boroughs. We have 5 boroughs here in New York City, and they're located in the boroughs to advocate on behalf of those who are picked up on prostitution-related charges and to advocate for services versus jail time. And we also have a family court advocate that deals with our girls and young women under the age of 16. The legal age of consent in adulthood is 16 in New York State, so any age under 16 is still considered a minor. So whether the biological families are still involved, whether they're involved in the child welfare system, they have an advocate for the family courts. We also have outreach department, and we're not doing street outreach as much any longer. However, we're doing quite a bit of outreach in the residential facilities, group homes, schools, just a lot of outreach on there. The trauma-based therapy and clinical supervision, I'll go into a little bit later on of kind of our motto and how being trauma-informed is extremely crucial to the work that we do, and that it leads the work that we do. It's not just the work that we do. Case management that we have as well. We have transitional housing. So we have a transitional housing from our 16 to 21-year-olds, and then we have an independent housing for our 21 to 24-year-olds. And then we have youth development, youth leadership, which encompasses education initiative, weekly groups, just various programs along that way. So I'll try to touch bases upon that a little bit into more depth as we go into the webinar. Also, as I mentioned earlier, in the training department here, we travel and we train law enforcement and prosecutors, judges, social service providers, faith-based organizations, educators, just any and all, and healthcare professionals as well, who are first responders in this movement and also who work with young people in general. And here's our model, and this is the model that we lead by, and I also will kind of go into a little bit more toward the end of the presentation because this is where we currently would like to see the movement moving toward. So we have a victim survivor leader model, and please be aware that we definitely understand that not everyone has, they don't go through this particular process in the timeline. We use it as contextual purposes to kind of frame the work that we're doing and to kind of make sure that we are providing individual services along this particular model. So the victim password, so we have victim, right? When our girls and young women come in, we don't necessarily want them to identify as a label. The victim perspective is to help us let them know that they have been a victim of a crime, right? The crime of being involved in the commercial sex industry. As I mentioned before, if they're picked up on, crimes or prostitution-related charges, that they're a victim of this. This isn't a choice. This is something that they did, but this is something that was done to them. So once again, that they're not having to identify as a label of a victim, but understanding the context in which we are providing the services at that moment. But of course, as we are girls and young women empowerment organizations, our goal is to empower that to that survivor level, right? Getting back enrolled in school, having stable housing, receiving benefits, just very much so getting back acclimated into learning those life skills and being and knowing that they are a survivor of the commercial sex industry and that they have made it through this situation that they were once in, and then ultimately getting them to the leader component. We have a Survivor Leadership Institute, which is really speaking about empowering our girls and young women to not only become leaders in their lives and leaders in the movement, but leaders in life, getting to where we had a recent More Than a Survivor art exhibit where we were just honoring survivors across the nation who are really just doing amazing things, who are now doctors and lawyers and scientists and owning their own businesses and motivational speakers, and just really seeing how with the support and the resources how someone really can advance in their lives and really grow forth. So that's kind of what our model is and how we base services here. So we have the direct service component in which I spoke of earlier, the public awareness and education. This is why many of you all are on this webinar today, to kind of receive more awareness and the tools to really best service our young people. And then the advocacy and systemic reform. We're very big on going to policy meetings and advocating for laws and making sure and providing and empowering, once again, our girls and young women to have a voice, and not just a voice in the movement, but a voice in other aspects when we talk about laws and policies and procedures and guidelines that are best servicing for them. And just to keep in mind that all of our components are survivor-led and survivor-informed. Our CEO, founder, Rachel Lloyd, founded GEMS 16 years ago. We are celebrating our 16th year this year, and Rachel is a survivor of the commercial sex industry. She was trafficked in the UK area, and those of you who don't know her story, I definitely recommend reading her memoir, her book, Girls Like Us, as it really explains how she really came to the idea of GEMS and how she started at the age of 23 with a borrowed computer and $30 at the kitchen table, and 16 years later where we are in GEMS. So all of our training, all of our program is survivor-led and survivor-informed. So what I really want to do now is go into a clip that really, because due to time, and we usually do a training similar to this in a 3-day format, because we have an hour and a half today, I wanted to throw in some media clips so that you all can kind of understand the issue that we are talking about and see it in a visual perspective. It's about a 5-minute clip. Once again, please keep in mind it's shot and the scenes are in New York City, but once again, the conditioning and the things that are mentioned in this clip usually are the same across the nation, and it is narrated by our founder, Rachel Lloyd. So I'll put that in for you all. Okay. I was reading, I think a couple of you weren't able to hear the audio via the media clip, and I'll kind of debrief it just a little bit. And it was narrated by Rachel Lloyd, and just really walking through what kind of the precursors and kind of the continuum of what our young people experience prior to being recruited into the commercial sex industry, also known as the life, and kind of just the low self-esteem and the risk factors that are at hand, and how it really triumphs into the area of being recruited into the commercial sex industry. And I'll go into this a little bit more as we kind of talk about the continuum of abuse that our young people experience prior to being recruited into the commercial sex industry. And then she also goes into a little bit more about how people perceive you and how they look at you with disgust and of judgment, and how the reactions are to you, and kind of this perception of kind of as a young person when you're first being recruited into the commercial sex industry, everything that was once promised to you and everything that once seemed to be okay, the actual reality of what actually occurs. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more when we discuss impact. So I'll go into that a little bit as we continue on. So as any training and any time we speak, we always want to go into the issue of language. Language is extremely important in our society. It guides how we interact with one another, really drives our conversations. So the importance of language in the movement, especially when we're working with victims, is extremely important and valuable. So we do this activity of teen prostitution or child teen prostitute versus commercially sexual exploitation or commercially sexual exploited child. So when we think of the term child teen prostitute, these are the words and terms that tend to come to mind. Resistant, easy, they're making a lot of money, so therefore they enjoy it. It's a choice. They chose to do this. They chose to enter into the commercial sex industry. Most of the time we think of kids involved in a system, so juvenile justice system, child welfare system, some type of system they're involved in, right? And we also hear the terms of they're a hoe, they're a slut, they're a prostitute, right? It goes in terms with that term prostitute. We often perceive the stilettos, the mini skirts, the fishnet stockings, and often when we see this child teen prostitute in a neighborhood, we will call law enforcement, right? And it's usually because of that term, prostitute and prostitution. However, when we think of the term sexually exploited child, it really shifts our mindset. Now we start to think of that they need help. They're now a victim in this. This is not anything that they chose to do. They're abused, they're neglected, they want to be rescued, they need to be rescued. They're controlled by an adult, and that they're trapped. And often we'll kind of hear this issue as it's everyone's problem. We're calling social service providers. We're calling law enforcement once again because we feel that someone should be in charge of this. Someone should have to pay for exploiting this child. We also may consider giving them health care services and taking them to the hospital or the clinic to be examined. So we really start to shift our mindset once we start using different language. And this is the language and the point where we're getting at in the movement of how valuable it is. Because we're still seeing, no matter how the articles are and as much as attention is being brought into the movement, when we use this term, child teen prostitute, it really invalidates what we're actually saying, because the term and the stigma of prostitute and prostitution for so long has held such a heavy weight that we can't really see a victim in that, right? We can't see the victimization of actual what occurs in the commercial sex industry. So, and as any type of movement, and recently in the news, as we've seen, even with domestic violence, right? Domestic violence wasn't termed domestic violence. Well, today it's termed intimate partner violence. But many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, that wasn't what it was termed. It was more of a husband-wife issue, and there wasn't as many services. There wasn't a police unit involved. But now we actually have shelters and resources and police units that are actually pertaining to that issue. And it doesn't mean that domestic violence has ended or it has stopped, but we have shifted the mindset about it, and it's no longer acceptable. And that's where we're moving in with the issue of commercial sexual exploitation and domestic sex trafficking. So I'm going to challenge, if we're not already using this language, and to really talk about commercial sexual exploitation a little bit more. We'll we'll go into the next slide on really defining the differences between the two. So this is once again just talking about how we reframe the issue, and we kind of frame this issue of child abuse, especially when we're talking about children and young people, but often and not really just getting stuck in the child component, but even talking about our young adults. At GEMS, like I mentioned before, we service girls and young women ages 12 through 24, and a lot of our members are over the age of 18. So just because they come to us at 18, do we not shift the language and now all of a sudden you're 18 and you're a prostitute, but now you're still a victim. You've been involved in the commercial sex industry, right? You've still been commercially sexually exploited in some format. And when I talk about the common age of entry, we'll see why we do that term. But kind of just, right, basic definition of what commercial sexual exploitation of children is: sexual activity involving a child in exchange for something of value or promise thereof. The promise thereof component is very important for us to grasp, and understanding that this is a form of violence against children. So we've created this framework to really kind of delve into the intersections of abuse. So if we're talking, all of what we're talking about today, if we're talking about a minor under the age of 18, is child sexual abuse, right? So a child, and we're talking about a definition of child sexual abuse where consent can or cannot be given, right? And that's kind of a defining definition, but as we understand, child really can't give consent to have any type of sexual content provided to them. And then also, and it doesn't have to mean touching. It can mean sexual touching. It can mean pornography. It can mean voyeurism, right? Those are various areas of child sexual abuse that we're speaking about. So if we go into the term sexual exploitation, removing the commercial piece, we're then talking about the imbalance of power, right? An adult taking an unfair advantage of a child. In this particular example, we can talk about a teacher-student. We could talk about a parent-child. And if we're saying, say this in a sexual exploitation, you have a 14, 15-year-old teen, and she's in the mall and she meets this guy. He's in his 30s. He begins to take her out, take her to the movies, buy her dinner, buy her clothing, and he's not asking for anything in return. But her being 14 and 15, what else can she give him back besides her body, right? So she begins to sleep with him or provide sexual favors just because he's doing so much for her, and she doesn't really have anything to give him back at such a young age. If we move into the commercial piece, adding the commercial piece into that, say the same 14, 15-year-old young woman gets into a fight with her parents and she runs away from home. Now she doesn't have any place to stay, so she calls up this man in which she's been dating and seeing and tells him the situation, and he says, you know what, yes, you can come stay with me, but now in order for you to have a place to live, you have to sleep with me. That is when we move into the commercial piece, right? A promise thereof of goods. So I'm promising you that you have a place to stay if you sleep with me. And if we're moving into the domestic minor sex trafficking component, say this man, once again, he calls his friends and he calls his buddies and he says, I have this 15-year-old in my home. I've slept with her, I've broken her in, she's good to go, and you can sleep with her too, but now you have to pay me. As soon as the third party begins to profit from someone, that's when we have the domestic sex trafficking component. So when we talk about, and I'll go ahead, we have our animated features here. So just when we're speaking about under the age of 18 involved in the commercial sex industry, that is commercial sexual exploitation and a third party profiting. So when we go into domestic sex trafficking, we're really talking about not even movement. And oftentimes people feel that it has to be movement across state borders and lines in order to be seen as trafficking. However, a young person does not have to leave their home, a hotel room, or one particular place to be a victim of sex trafficking. So when moving into what this all includes, so we talk about street exploitation, the well-known tracks and areas where, and that's often the perception that we have when we talk about and speak about women in the commercial sex industry, but also the idea of child pornography, as technology is just a wonderful thing and we're developing it, so has the demand for child pornography and pornographic images. So as that we actually have law enforcement, so Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, that day in, day out, they're working on child pornography cases. Stripping. A lot of people often don't consider stripping and strip clubs part of the commercial sex industry, but it is. Erotic nude escort services, phone sex fines, private parties, gang-based exploitation. That's actually huge now. What we're understanding and finding with the organized crime, that if if they're doing and selling drugs and in the drug trafficking, that they can only sell an amount of drugs for one time. However, they're seeing that it's profitable to sell a young woman multiple times. So they're really moving into the commercial sex industry. Into familial pimping. So we're talking about family-based exploitation. So it can be a father, it can be an uncle, it can be a brother, a sibling. That's what we're talking about for interfamilial pimping. And, of course, internet-based exploitation. So we have our Backpage and various other escort sites that are out and available now. And this just goes back to the minor sex trafficking component of the third party that profits from sexual activity, and with the child originating from the country in which the activity occurs. So oftentimes when we think of trafficking, we think of international issues, that it's not happening here. That's something that occurs in Thailand and the Philippines and everywhere else but here. And that's the shift that we're moving toward, and the movement is getting people to understand it's happening right here in our backyards. And although we are never discounting the international component of there, and there are many organizations and agencies that really hone in on that particular population. However, our concern here at GEMS is really focusing on a domestic issue and focusing on our young people who originally are born here in the U.S. So if we're talking about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, that was originally authorized in 2000 and has been reauthorized many times in 2003, 2005, 2008, and then recently in 2013 under the Violence Against Women's Act. So that is our federal law that says that sex trafficking in which a commercial sex is induced by force, fraud, or coercion in which a person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. When this act initially passed, we were extremely excited here at GEMS. Like, we finally have a law. There's something that's finally in place for our girls and young women to receive services. But during the initial phase of that time, they weren't really pertaining to us. So they were saying real trafficking victims, not the teen child prostitutes in which you deal with. So it was still kind of that separate mindset. Once again, if we go back to that language and how keen that language is in shifting our perspective, that was one of the advocacy areas in which we really were working toward advocating for. And if we want a little bit more into that, we can definitely provide that information, but that's the federal law. Here in New York State, as many states across the country now are putting in anti-trafficking provisions, right? We have the safe harbor law here in New York State that basically states if a young person is picked up on prostitution-related charges and they have not reached the age of 16, they are no longer just detained. They are offered other services. So they'll be mandated to come to GEMS and to receive services versus having detention time or jail time. But if they're over the age of 16, that's when they can still be charged as an adult. So we're still working on some advocacy there. But we have something in place for our minors under the age of 16. And so CSEC in the United States, right now we are really getting better statistics. As over the years, statistics have been a little skewed based upon if they were looking for victims who actually had an exploiter or a pimp, and they were under pimp control. It was very difficult to have, a group of individuals who were under pimp control sit in a focus group for a $15, $20 stipend, and they had a higher stipend to meet and quota to meet for the day. So some of the statistics that we use are, one is from the Estes and Weiner report back in 2001 that states at least 100,000 to 300,000 youth are at risk for the commercial sex industry annually in the U.S. And when we go into risk factors in a little bit, we'll kind of see that 300,000 and more is probably around the ballpark where we should really be focusing on. At least 100,000 children are used in the commercial sex industry in the U.S., and that came from Shared Hope. And here's the one that the most common age of entry into the commercial sex industry here in the U.S. is 12 to 14. very, very young, and we're even seeing as young as 9 and 10-year-olds who are also being recruited into the commercial sex industry. So once again, when we're speaking about the adults, so the 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old adults who are involved in the commercial sex industry, we have to be mindful that oftentimes they did not enter when they were adults. They entered at 12. They entered at 11, 14, 15 years of age, and this is what they've known and been conditioned to for so long. So even when we have a 22-year-old that may walk through our doors here at GEMS, we're very mindful of the fact that she may have entered into the commercial sex industry at 13, at 15, at 16 years of age, and we have to still treat her as a victim of such. So a lot of things that we talk about, we like to discuss the issue of demand. And what is the contributing factor, the reason why the statistics are so high and so many young people are at risk and so many people are being recruited into the commercial sex industry? What are we really talking about? So we usually have a huge demand wheel that kind of talks about the advancement of technology and the prevalence of the commercial sex industry, the billion-dollar adult sex industry that's present. And we talk about the issue of highly sexualized society. And really focusing in on these three areas here, right? Sexism, racism, classism, and how the commercial sex industry intertwines right in the middle. And it's difficult to pull one of these factors without discussing the others. And oftentimes this can be a difficult conversation to have, but a very much so needed conversation if we're really addressing the root of this issue, right? So the sexism, right? We live in a very patriarchal society, right? So of just really understanding what that looks like for women. Women are very highly sexualized in our society, from the media to the movies, and we have to be cognizant of that. Also, even when we teach our children coming up, and if a girl is into sports, that she shouldn't be into sports. She should be more into dressing pretty and wearing makeup and things as such. If a boy wants to be a little bit more soft-mannered, then we say you're acting like a girl. If you're crying, you're acting like a girl. So we have very defined roles in society, and which really brings up that prevalence of sexism. Classism and racism really go hand in hand. When we talk about one of our known points here in New York City of Hunts Point, where it's been prevalent for a commercial sex industry for many, many, many years, and how it is one of the lowest congressional points in the nation, and how they're very, very impoverished area. And oftentimes when we talk to our girls and young women who have been exploited in the area, they also grew up in the area, right? So it's high levels of homelessness, the commercial sex industry, high levels of substance abuse as well. And then we also talk about the racism component and how usually the zip code that you're born into kind of determines what resources are available to you. And if there were other resources and other safety nets and supports involved, where would we be at in the commercial sex industry? So really, once again, referring to the foundation of the issue and moving toward why our young people are at risk and the risk factors that are available there. So what I want to do is, in following suit with that, is go into this clip, and we collaborated with the MTVU, which is a university website, and they do a lot of advocacy and awareness for the universities, and Rachel collaborated with them and really wanted to create a human trafficking PSA. So it is taking place in a hotel room and really shows the demand side, the different faces of the demand of the men who are purchasing. And we always like to say, yes, we understand that women purchase sex as well. However, the over majority of people who are purchasing sex are men. So really focusing on the men here, and then also really focusing on the victim and her disassociation as well when they endure going through such things. So we will play that. And once again, I do apologize for those of you who are not able to hear the media clip, but I will debrief afterwards. Okay. Very short clip, very powerful clip on just really putting a face to the issue of demand. And often when we speak of demand, people have the perception, oh, it's just, dirty old guys who are seeking out sex. But our goal here in that video clip was to show the different faces, right? We're speaking of family men. We're speaking of professional men. We're speaking of various men in our communities and people that we may know and hold to high standards who are also engaging in the commercial sex industry. So the video did show the various faces of the buyers. Also showing just this young woman in this disassociation state of just, I'm tired, I don't enjoy this, this is something that I'm made to do and I have to do, but it's a true reality. And it's really important for us to focus in on the feelings and things because we often don't see that when we hear about victims of the commercial sex industry. We often can't see how they cope with and what their reactions are while enduring night after night of having to sleep with multiple men. So after this clip, I want to take the time to take a moment to answer a few questions, and if there are any that have come through since the beginning.
Great. Thanks, Jenaya, so much. We have a couple of questions. One is, could you address if you see any harm or complication in the use of the word rescue? Particularly, what about victims who don't necessarily identify as victims and don't feel that they need rescuing?
Very good question. I actually wanted to go into that a little bit later, but I can address it now. Yes, we do hear and that's a huge pushback of what's going on in the movement versus rescue versus empowerment. And I will talk a little bit more about that in our VSL component because it can be a little bit dangerous. And we get stuck into just that victim stage. And our rescue mentality can be very much so re-victimizing and re-traumatizing for our young people. So I will actually address that a little bit more in the presentation when we get into the VSL model.
Great, thank you. And then what about the folks, there's certain organizations and groups and individuals that are advocating for rights for sex workers to be able to continue in the sex industry and profit in a healthy way. One of our participants is wondering if there's any form of sex work or pornography that in no way affects the problem of human trafficking.
That is a little bit, that's usually when we get into the conversation of the legalization component. It's all affecting part of it, right? Even whether it's by those who are in it willingly or those who are in it not by their choice. But it's the demand for it. It's the presence of it that's available. So if you have a small component who say, you know what, this is what I want to do and this is what I would like to engage in, it still creates that demand. So even if there has to be a supply to meet that demand. So some way or format, you are going to have those who are against their wills and those who have been coerced into the commercial sex industry to continue to meet that demand.
Great, thank you. And, we'll sort of ask you to continue on with this great information and webinar, but please, for the participants, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we come back to them either at another part in the webinar or towards the end. Thank you, Jenaya.
Thank you. So, yes, please feel free to keep the questions coming, and I'll take another break in the next couple of slides to address those. So once again, when we talk about that issue of choice, and I appreciate the last question of just really as we transition into this, and we took this quote from one of our members, it's not a choice. No one just wakes up and wants to do this. You can't just walk away either. And oftentimes we have this perception of, you know what, it's bad, it's terrible, and if you don't want to be there, why don't you just leave? Right? That's usually the question we receive across the board. So we'll go a little bit into that in a moment. So some of the risk factors. What are making our young people at risk for being recruited into the commercial sex industry? So we have this list can go on and on and on, but as I spoke about earlier, the classism, racism component is extremely important. Homeless and runaway youth. Oftentimes when I'm in more suburban, rural areas, they'll tell me, you know what, Jenaya, I understand the information in which you're providing. However, we don't have a known track here, and we don't have street exploitation. But my question usually is, well, do you have homeless runaway youth? Yes, we do. Do we have a lot of programming for them? Well, no, we don't. Then you probably have a presence of the commercial sex industry there, because where are they going? And usually our homeless runaway youth are at even higher risk for the commercial sex industry, because you'll hear the term a lot, survival sex, right, for exchanging sex for a place to live, for food to eat, for clothing to wear, right? And that is not a term that we like at all, because what child should have to have sex to survive in the United States or anywhere at all? So really kind of discussing that homelessness and runaway population as well. Also, the neglect and abuse when we talk about youth involved in child welfare, LGBTQ youth, right? And when we talk about this issue affecting our transgendered young people, is extremely, extremely high risk, right, of not having acceptance. I've gone to various conferences where we hear about our young people being kicked out of their homes, not having a place to stay, looking for a community in which they can identify with, right, really focusing in on that. Mental health issues, that's a huge clinical part. And for my clinicians on the phone, I'm sure that we all can be in agreement that that's a high risk for a lot of different avenues, right? Substance abuse, access to technology. I just spoke about how the exploitation online is just growing daily. The access that you have now, where it used to be a little hidden, store or magazine or somewhere that you put in a paper bag, is now available on your cell phone. You're now able to access sexual websites on your cell phone now. So the accessibility to technology extremely puts our young people at risk. The street-involved culture, right? Sexualization of our girls and our young women in society, as I spoke about earlier. The acceptance of violence and acceptance of violence for women and minority groups is extremely important to look at. And this unaddressed trauma piece, and I like to go into that a little bit of just speaking about how it's not always just the individual's responsibility to address trauma, but once again, if we go back to the resources that are available in one's life to discuss trauma, was there a platform to have clinical services or counseling services to address trauma? Also, trauma, when we define trauma, does that look like trauma for someone that has just been a normalization for them, right? Domestic violence and abuse, or substance abuse, has been something that's been so normalized, it may not be considered trauma to that particular individual as it is to us working in various professions. Also, culturally, right, it's very important for us to identify what the cultural meaning is for trauma. Sometimes we have different cultures and various practices that says, what happens in a family stays in a family. Anything that occurs, we don't speak about it outside of our home. We don't speak about it with other individuals, right? You're at a higher risk if you say something versus if you don't say anything. So really, I wanted to pay a little bit more attention to the unaddressed trauma component, because that's tend to what we do in the movement. We go for the trauma and then having to understand what trauma really is defined as for a particular individual. So these are many risk factors across the board that, a lot of our young people are susceptible to. Although we have this one particular risk factor that's extremely important across the board that we see with boys, girls, transgender youth, just young people in general. Sexual exploitation, having a history of child sexual abuse, right? 70 to 90% of sexually exploited children have a history of child sexual abuse. And we're looking at kind of the higher end when we're talking about our members here at GEMS. So really understanding that child sexual abuse component plays a huge role. So even when we're talking about the prevention and early intervention methods to really inhibit our young people from being recruited into the commercial sex industry, focusing on this child sexual abuse component is extremely important. I spoke earlier about the continuum of sexual abuse, and this is another framework that we have created at GEMS to really dispel and break down some of the issues that we're speaking about today. Once again, noting that no one's life happens in this particular timeline, right? But this is just giving us a framework to go off of. So even if we're thinking about the intersections of abuse wheel that I spoke of earlier, in this child sexual abuse component, what does this look like, right? As you're 3, you're 5, you're 6 years of age, and someone who's abusing you is someone who's supposed to love you. It can be a family member, a close friend. So now you're linking love, sex, and abuse together, right? You're telling me you love me, however, you're sexually abusing me. So you can't really distinguish the difference between the three. And then you have this violation of boundaries. Your perception of clear boundaries have been taken away from you because of you experienced this child sexual abuse. The guilt and the shame, because our bodies react and a child's body reacts to any type of abuse, whether sexual abuse, penetration, or whatnot. So the guilt and shame that we have heard some of our girls and young women saying, you know what, you must have liked it. Your body reacted to it. You wanted this. This wasn't something that I did to you. You wanted it. You asked for it. Your body enjoyed it. You liked it. So really having that stigma as a child that I did something wrong, right, and viewing themselves as a sexual object when we see very hyper-sexualized children and really understanding where that behavior has stemmed from. Kind of moving forward, right, if this young person decides to tell a teacher, tell another family member, tell someone that they're being abused, they may have child welfare stepping involved. So now they're in a foster home or group home residential facility, and they don't want to be there. And oftentimes those facilities have re-traumatized some of our girls and young women, so they run away, and now there's a poverty and a need for it. So if we go back to that intersections of abuse and they have someone in their life, an adult in their life, who's providing the needs, a place to stay, food to eat, clothing, they have that unequal power dynamics, right? So once again, that they're sleeping with someone to have survival needs met. So along the way, now you have the media influence, you have this billion-dollar sex industry that's telling you that everything that you're doing already, you can get paid for it, and that it's glorified and there's nothing wrong with it. So by the time a recruiter approaches you or an exploiter approaches you, you've learned quite a few things that you needed to learn to survive in the commercial sex industry. So now only thing that the exploiter recruiter has to do is condition you and manipulate all of those factors that you've learned to make you take heed to survive in the commercial sex industry. So this particular continuum just really shows that a lot of steps along the way groom our young people are ready to survive in the commercial sex industry. And the pimps exploiters don't have to do much. They just have to play off of those, and they have to fill the voids wherever there is a void. So different ways that pathway of entry can occur, right? We spoke about familial pimping. Violence and force is oftentimes what we hear and people perceive as the way of entry, when often it's the seduction and coercion part, right, of just, you know, you're beautiful, I love you, I can provide for you. If we're dealing with those issues of low self-esteem, if we're dealing with those issues of need, once again, exploiters know what to really pinpoint and what voice to fill. And then they also play the factor of, I'm your boyfriend, right? We're together. I love you. I take care of you. And if you love me, you would do this for me, right? We definitely have our issues of kidnapping and violence of force that often occurs. And the violence and force, even in the seduction coercion, comes later. That's usually a tactic to keep our young people compliant. So false advertising, modeling, acting, dancing. With technology, once again, you don't actually have to have a studio anymore to record music or to shoot professional photography. Everything can occur within a home. Peer recruitment, so we talked and spoke about earlier about group homes and residential facilities, but also in the schools. There's a lot of peer recruitment happening amongst peers in the schools, so we were called in our outreach team to have a presentation, and the counselor was mentioning to our outreach manager, I called you because I actually identified some exploiters in some of my junior and senior males, and that they're exploiting some of the junior and senior females. And then also, right, the internet enticement, Facebook, Instagram, a lot of our social media sites as well. So when we speak about ways of that CSEC impacts our society. And as much as we want to say, you know what, we have a victim-centered approach, this is very important to focus just on the victims, we recognize and understand that this is not the truth for so many different professions and so many people. If it's not in their neighborhoods or in their communities or affecting someone that they can closely relate to, it's a little bit of a distance for them to understand. So we begin to speak about how this issue affects our society as a whole, putting it in perspective of that it costs taxpayers dollars. Anytime we're advocating anywhere for policies, when we bring this in there, now we have gained your attention. When we speak about money and the cost of the taxpayer dollars, then we have all the attention in the world. Right? The safety in the neighborhood, it decreases that. Links to other types of crime I spoke about earlier about the gang-based exploitation, the organized crime. That's extremely increasing right now. It creates that demand, as we spoke about earlier when we're speaking about, well, you know what, if we kind of have the sex workers' rights, what does that mean for human trafficking? It still creates that demand, right, and increases the recruitment of our children to make sure that we're creating enough supply. Cost of resources, social service and healthcare systems, right? We're creating other organizations, drop-in centers. We're creating a lot to really address this issue, and it's costing a lot of money. Law enforcement, right? We're doing human trafficking task force now and human trafficking task force courtrooms. So it's a lot of money that we're being put into these resources. And then the long-term impacts on adult women that are involved in the commercial sex industry as well. So we like to really put this framework in perspective for those who are, okay, we get their victims and understand and sad for them, but how does this apply to me? And here are those ways to answer those questions. So, and this is just a study with the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center that speaks about the early intervention and the prevention aspect and how it really is a benefit to really invest earlier. And they were in this statement, you all can see, early intervention to avoid sex trading and trafficking in Minnesota's female youth passes a rigorous benefit cost test with a return on investment of $34 in benefit for each dollar in cost. Right, so stating that Minnesota taxpayers invest in prevention and early intervention for runaway and homeless youth are at high risk, benefits way more than if they wait until someone is being recruited into the commercial sex industry and have to provide services at that moment. So really honing in on that. And once again, as we spoke about statistics earlier and how we're getting better with our young people, we took a lot of statistics from our adult women, just really talking about the violence. And this has been known for so long as a victimless crime, but we know to be true that violence is inherent in the commercial sex industry. You can't get around it, right? So this is basically stating 62% of respondents had been raped in the commercial sex industry. 73% experienced physical assault. 72% were currently or formerly homeless. 92% stated that they wanted to escape the commercial sex industry, but they lacked the means to do so. And then 78% of 55 women who sought help reported being raped an average of 16 times a year by pimps and raped 33 times a year by johns. Violence is inherent. It is a normal part, and it happens often. And it's really important for us to understand that when we are working with victims of what they're really being exposed to and what they're really experiencing out here. So, and this is just a question for you all to reflect on your own. So what impact does this level of violence and abuse have on an individual? We have to really understand, you know what, even as we're sitting here as professionals, to kind of speak about the risk factors that I spoke about earlier, talk about the violence that's happening there, what long-term impact does it have on us? So we've created this wheel, this impact wheel in which we call, and we've kind of decided to focus on various areas and just put a couple factors up, right? If we're talking about the spiritual impact, it could mean religion, it could not mean religion. But I really like to highlight the lack of belief in humanity, right? How can humanity be this cruel? How can another human being provide such violence, such control, such inhumane actions against another human being? And everyone who's supposed to help has passed judgment. You're nothing but a prostitute. You're nothing but a slut. You're nothing but a hoe. You don't matter in our society. We just want you locked away and out of our sight so we don't have to deal with it, right? How can humanity be so cruel? The physical impact, we speak about the continual rapes. It's gang rapes all the time that occurs, STDs and STIs. Very much so an important part, right? HIV and AIDS, we actually have an HIV AIDS Awareness Week that we really hone in and focus in honor of a member in which we lost to HIV/AIDS, and how important it is for us to discuss what's going on there, right? Pregnancy, wanted and unwanted, and that not only has a physical impact, but also an emotional impact. If someone has a child by their exploiter and they decide to leave and exit the commercial sex industry, what long-term impact does that have? To have to continually see this exploiter and this man because you all have a child together. And oftentimes we've seen, right, exploiters hold that over a victim's head and say, you know what, if you leave, I'll take our child away. Or if you leave, you know, what's going to happen to our child? So that guilt trip on that. Sterility, right? We had a young person who had been carrying STI for so long. By the time she came into our programming and we took her to receive treatment, it was too late. So to tell a 16-year-old that you can no longer have children based upon something that is done to you is very heartbreaking, right? Tattoos and branding, very explicit on the neck, on the arms. We've seen, right, barcodes. We've seen very explicit names and exploiters' names tattooed on our girls and young women. Substance abuse and addiction, extremely huge part. But oftentimes we feel like that is the reason why they stay in there, when usually it's a coping mechanism, right? As we saw in the hotel room video, that disassociation piece, like you have to have something to kind of check out in order to do this day in, day out, right? Self-cutting and then suicide and death. Social impact, the disconnection from the community, right? Isolation from mainstream society. Incarceration, something that is definitely, right, advocating for that, to have criminal records expunged based upon being in the commercial sex industry. Lack of life skills. If you've been in the life since you were 12, that's what's raised you. You don't have the life skills to balance a checkbook or to apply for an apartment, for housing. You're really lacking that because so much of your life has been taken from you. We have a huge issue on, we have a huge focus, I should say, on education here. It's very important for us to focus on education, whether it's back to traditional, right, back into elementary school or high school, GED testing, but really pushing forward to post-secondary. We had one of our young women recently admitted into a pre-med program. Extremely great celebration for us to see that and to know that the support services and with guidance and support that someone actually can go back and to receive their education, extremely important. Emotional impact, right? This anger, rage is what I really like to focus on, because often when we're working with victims, we consider them to be resilient. I mean, I shouldn't say resilient. I consider them to be resilient. We usually consider them to be resistant if we're first working with them. They have an attitude. They're yelling at us. They're screaming at us. They don't want to accept our services. Now you're resistant. So now you're actually not a victim. I really believe that you chose to do this. But once again, if we're thinking about all of this that they've been impactful in their lives and everything else that's happened prior to when we speak about that continuum of sexual abuse, you would be a little angry as well and not very much so willing to accept the trust of those who are, perpetuating that they're going to help you or seeming as if they're going to help you at that time. And then the psychological, emotional impact is extremely important. Speaking about that bond, right, that trauma bond, we speak a lot about in our other trainings about Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding and how the emotional and mental chains are way stronger than a physical chain. So when we say, why don't they just leave, there's a door, they're not chained to anything. But what's going on with the emotional bonds? What's going on with the mental chains that are happening there? So really understanding that, and also the PTSD as well. So here's the impact wheel. Once again, if you all have it, I encourage you all to look at it a little bit more in depth to really see what we're talking about when we're discussing impact. I want to take another moment right now to pause for a second to see if there are any other questions that I can answer before we finish the last section.
Thanks, Jenaya. We have a couple of questions regarding risk and risk factors. One is about children of blended families. Are children who are kind of divided into different homes and different households, do you see, a higher incident or experience of possible trafficking with those situations?
We have, and I'm glad someone actually brought up the fact of having a two-parent household, and even if it is a blended family. We have, depending upon what's actually occurring in the home. If there's a new family that has started and the young person could be the only child from the previous marriage, the feeling of isolation, the feeling of rejection that occurs. Also, depending upon what the home life is, what is the relationship like with the other parent? Is there still a co-parenting? Has someone actually taking, if there's a step-parent involved, how's the relationship there, right? Is the home life comfortable? If not, then you'll have our young people that we have, they've run away, they don't want to be there anymore, they don't feel loved, they don't feel accepted, they feel rejected, they feel isolated because here's a new family that has started and they don't feel like they're part of it. So yes, we have seen that as well.
And how do you continue, or how do you work with a youth who may have been victimized but then also becomes a recruiter and recruits other girls in a foster care setting or in a home? I mean, so somebody who might be a survivor themselves but then goes on to perpetrate and try and, recruit other girls into this. How do you intervene in that circumstance?
I think one of the key things is understanding and recognizing that it's not malicious. Right, these are things that are conditioned and manipulative behaviors that are really taught and learned in the environment. And recruiting, as we see quite often, they're still undergoing all of the impacts, all of the abuse and violence, just as they are at this moment of being put in a position to recruit. And we often have to think of, too, what would the consequences be if they're not recruiting? Like, are they under pimp control? Do they have an exploiter that is a priority for them is to recruit, and that's their soul? And if they are, say they're the bottom girl, which is the top girl in the house, that's usually their primary responsibility is to recruit and to, look after the other girls. Recruitment here in GEMS, we have a zero tolerance for it just because we want to have a confidential and safe space. However, just if a member is found to be recruiting, we make sure they can't come back in the space for a while. However, we provide them services outside of the space because, once again, we recognize that they still are victims of this issue at hand, but we have to do it in a more individualized program manner for them.
Great. And then before you go on, I know that you are going to talk a little bit about some of the intervention strategies that you use at GEMS. Are you able to also talk about any successful prevention models, including how to engage faith communities and churches and synagogues in sort of the efforts to prevent?
One of the biggest things of prevention is awareness and knowledge. Truly understanding what this issue is. I actually spoke on a couple different panels for a couple churches, and one church actually wanted to focus on their younger population. So they wanted girls and young women there at 9, 10, 11 years of age, and my only request was, if a parent or the guardian has not openly discussed the issue of sex, this may not be the best time to hear this. So really the awareness and knowledge component is extremely important, really getting the understanding of what this issue is. And then once the risk factors are acknowledged, then faith-based community social service providers across the board can go back to their respective organizations and work on what can we put in place for that, right? We get calls all the time that are stating, we want to come in, we want to volunteer, and we want to help with outreach. We're really talking about, well, have you volunteered at the after-school programs? Have you volunteered at the Boys and Girls Club, YMCAs, things that really need that prevention mentoring, that time spent, other resources and activities brought on for our young people. That's where our prevention is. But if we're talking about getting other people on board, the awareness and education component is huge because you can't prevent something if you really don't know what it is.
Great. And then, we've just had a couple of other questions that I think is a very important but very difficult sort of question to answer, an issue to address. In the first video clip that you showed, such a powerful narration, but one of the things that was brought up was that this survivor experienced perpetration at the hands of law enforcement. And so participants are wondering how common, in your experience, this is that law enforcement can be involved in the perpetration of girls and youth. But then also, how do we sort of encourage girls and youth and their families to interact with law enforcement when there is that distrust?
The first part, good questions on that. Yes, that is not uncommon for us to speak with our girls and young women. They have had terrible experiences with officers, and not just from the perpetrator aspect, but just from the treatment and the disdain and the disgust and the treatment as prostitutes, right, and not as victims. However, we have worked with, we have a team of officers here in New York City who are just amazing, and they work very well with our girls, and they really trust them. And when they come into our space and they have to speak with our girls about something, they come in plain clothing, and we have a counseling room in which they're there, and they really make our girls feel comfortable. And we work with officers across the nation who are really doing great work, and their initiatives of being on board has really shown a different face to victims, that there are officers who are on your side and who are here to intervene and advocate for you and work with you. So as we continue, once again, that education is there and that awareness is there, and we're getting more on board, we're really showing face that officers are really, there are really great officers who are in the movement that are doing great things. So we, once again, we bring in our officers to show that with our girls and young women, and we try to encourage officers to get involved in the community more so than just a response basis, but to really in that prevention aspect, right? If we're talking about community events and meetings, of having officers show face that, you know what, we are here in a prevention aspect as well as in a responding aspect as well. So getting them on board. And it takes a team effort, right? It takes a team of having great officers on board for responding, social services on board for responding, healthcare. It's a community collaborative effort from all professions.
Great, thank you. And I know that you are about to talk about some of the trauma interventions. We have a couple of participants that are particularly interested in hearing about how you specifically address trauma, PTSD, the impact of violence, specific treatments, and if you at GEMS or if you know about any successful use of EMDR and other therapeutic models. So we'll let you kind of move into that, and we'll keep collecting these questions for you, Jenaya. Thank you.
Okay, sure. As far as the programming goes and concern, trauma-informed, and actually when we get to it coming up very soon, is one of our core principles, right? All of our staff, and it's very important for all staff to be trauma-informed, but that doesn't mean to go for the trauma, right? Having an awareness of the trauma, being exposed to understanding what our young people are facing drives and really shapes our programming that we do. But we try not to go just for the trauma because that can be a little overwhelming, especially when a young person just walks through the door and they're not even recognizing their situation as exploitive, and we go strictly for the trauma. We provide various services here, right? We do holistic care here at GEMS, so we have survivor-led counseling groups, which Rachel leads, her survivor group. We have other clinical groups that occur. We also have very therapeutic groups, non-traditional therapeutic groups, right? So we'll have yoga groups, we'll have just writing groups, we'll have art therapy and music therapy and just various different forms of just what doesn't look like non-traditional therapy of just counseling sessions, but in various ways in which the trauma is addressed wherever it is comfortable for our girls and young women at each time. For more intensive therapy sessions, we source out because, right, GEMS doesn't claim to be the end-all, be-all of everything, so we really collaborate with other organizations and agencies around in our areas that have also been trained on this issue to really allow them, especially for mental health referrals, substance abuse referrals, and more intense therapeutic counseling we refer out. But we do a range of counseling, and it all depends on the individual, right? We have an individual assessment plan and kind of what that particular individual needs at that time. What we provide, we will continually provide, and what we can't provide, we will outsource with it. So as we just kind of go forth and working with victims of just the tangible needs, right? And I feel like at this point in the movement, everyone is at this point where we're all looking for housing because there aren't enough beds. But not just crisis housing, long-term housing. So that's what we talk about, that victim survivor leader, of just moving past, okay, we have you off the streets and we have you here now and safe, but long-term, where are you going to live? Long-term, how are you going to sustain your living situation, right? Job, education, legal representation, right? We have a law firm that works with us pro bono that really has that advocacy. Very important. Medical, dental care, extremely important to have on board, right? One of my tasks has been in New York City is to train our healthcare professionals, really getting them to understand this issue. Counseling, case management, safety planning. Also, child care and parenting skills are extremely important. A lot of our girls and young women have children. What does that look like for them? How do we get them comfortable with allowing their children to go to daycare center and receiving parenting skills? Intangible needs, right? Non-judgmental environment. I can't stress that enough. Of just having a place where they feel like they can come and they can be themselves. And once they feel that comfort, you'll see that they'll receive services a lot quicker and a lot better because they feel that they're in an environment that's for them and not against them. Healthy adult relationships. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about our foundational principles here. A sense of empowerment, right, for their own healing and restoration, when we spoke a little bit about that rescue mentality, that someone's not doing this for me, but I'm receiving this skill set and I'm being equipped to do this for myself. Youth leadership opportunities and supportive peers, right, understanding that this is a recovery process, which I am about to go into now when we are talking about the stages of change, right? This is definitely a model that's not our own. It's an AA model, but we use it, right, because it really applies, and I often put an emphasis on this. If you don't take anything else what I say today, this is very important for the work that we do, of understanding that we are to meet our young people where they are at, right, and it could be in all different areas. Here at GEMS, we have young people who are currently actively involved in the life. We have young people who may have one foot in, one foot out, and we have young people who have been out of the life for a while. So really, what does your programming look like to address each of those individuals where they are at? So a pre-contemplation, this may be an area where they still haven't recognized the situation as exploited, and they're okay with that. They feel like this is a choice I made. I'm fine with it. It's great. I'm okay. You really can't tell me anything differently right now. Contemplation may be an area where they start to think, after being arrested a couple times or getting into trouble, you know what, this may be an issue that I'm really kind of getting tired of. But, if I have an pimp and exploiter, this is fine, right? This is still, I'm together. I'm not by myself in this. There are other people in this, so this is fine. Preparation, as they continue to program a little bit, they're being exposed to their education opportunities and job opportunities and other people who are doing well and succeeding, right? So they begin to start thinking, I can actually do this. In the action stage, they may be in the process of leaving the life, right? Getting back enrolled in school, getting some stable housing, right? Just really moving forth their lives and maintaining that. And sometimes it only takes that one go-round for someone who's been in the life as long as, I'm tired, I've gotten the opportunity, I'm going to maintain it, and then they can go on to stable behavior. But as you can see, we included relapse in this circle because we recognize that is process of their healing, right? That oftentimes they may relapse, and that's part of their healing, but we have to be okay with that. That means from social service providers, that means from law enforcement, that means across the board of recognizing that relapse is part of their particular journey, not ours. And oftentimes as professionals, we kind of get upset, like, what services didn't we provide? How could they do this? We did so much. We provided so much. And we begin to find ourselves thinking about us instead of them. So we have to remove our personal selves out of it and recognize as long as we've done everything that we could, provided the services, provided the support, now we've equipped them to move on with their choices in their lives, right? And often when they come back from relapse, they don't have to go back to pre-contemplation, contemplation. They can go back into preparation and even back into action. And really, when they relapse, come back to kind of see, what were those triggers? What kind of happened that led you back into that path? Like, what was going on around you? So really, really taking heed to this and recognizing that each of your, in the program, especially when we're talking long-term, what does that look like, right? Are we equipped to help those who are in this action, maintenance, stable behavior stage? Or are we solely focusing on this pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation stage, right? and kind of moving on in the movement and really focusing in on that. So, and these are some 3 key points that I wanted to leave with you all in that particular, right? Being aware of your actions when working with victims. Verbal actions, right? Not just what we say, how our body language is, some of our thought patterns, and it's difficult. Sometimes we have our own personal judgments and biases that we're coming along with, and we're steady getting new information and awareness, and it's a shifting process, right? One of my goals as I speak is not just to train, but just to provide things for people to shift on their own, right? I only want to give you nuggets, I only want to give you information, but the shift occurs with you. And our young people really recognize that. They recognize when someone is there because they're made to be there, or they still kind of have a disdain, disgust action, or when they really are there genuinely to assist and they believe that they can move forward, right? Once again, that non-judgmental attitude and tone, and treating the individual as a victim of trauma and abuse, right? Not that they have to wear that title, but you, once again, being trauma-informed that it is a lot of trauma that they're going through. It is a lot of impactful things that's going on, and that you're mindful of that when the treatment process is occurring. So this is one comment that we received about our space, right? The program is a space where I can be myself because it's like they don't judge me on things I do or things that I've been through in the past. So when we spoke about earlier about the rescue mentality, the need for VSL, right? GEMS is at this point in the movement where we're talking about that after the crisis moment, what now? When we're seeing our young people have stable housing and graduating from college and really moving forward, like really having that movement. Because right now, sex trafficking is, right, as Rachel often talks, the sexy topic. Everyone wants on board. Everyone wants to rescue, and we're taking Human Task Force, and we're doing all of the wonderful things. But what happens when this dies down? What happens when it's no longer the hot topic? We still have lives that are still there and have to be sustained after that. So really understanding that the rescue mentality just keeps within that victim stage, and it really limits us and limits the survivors in their recovery and their life journey. And it can be very damaging, right? We often have conversations about taking cell phones away and, really keeping them so closed in. But once they're back into the communities and society, have they really been equipped with the tools to really survive out there and to make better choices and decisions and things as such? So really talking about having an empowerment-based focus, things that can be put in place that can really equip and empower young people to move on and feel like they have control over their lives right now. Because as we speak about the impact, they haven't had that control, right? People have made decisions for them, whether directly or indirectly, according to their actions. So our VSL contributing framework, right? Speaking about the stages of change. In our VSL trainings, we go more into the internal, external, locus of control, right? Having that balance, safety planning, whether someone's still involved in their life or even after their life, right? What are those tools that they're equipped with to survive? Being trauma-informed, right? Really keep focusing on that strengths-based and youth development, right? Having that, like, are we really focusing on the strengths at hand, or is everything we focus on trauma, abuse, right? Are we really honing in on those strengths that are there? And then the peer support, right? We have a great, and this leads into our foundational principles of having the survivor leadership as well as transformational relationships. Our staff composes of survivor staff as well as ally staff, and it works well for our girls and young women to see, staff who's been in their positions in lives and where they are currently today, and to have and to empower also allies to know that you also play a role, right? You play a role in this of really whatever our education, our experiences to really share. And to collaborate together, it leaves a really good foundation in service providing for victims and survivors alike. So, and then going back to our core values, we have 6 core values in our 2 foundational principles, developmentally grounded, right? Being understanding, since we work with such a broad range of from 12 through 24, understanding what adolescent development looks like, what does trauma do to adolescent development, of really understanding that trauma stumps development. So although if we're working with a 17-year-old or even a 20-year-old, if they've been in traumatic situations since 3, what does that development look like for them, right? And is our programming reflective of that? I spoke about trauma-informed, culturally competent. Extremely important to know, and that doesn't just mean race and ethnicity, although GEMS definitely has our staff reflecting of the population in which we service, but also, right, music and age, right? What's going on in the different adolescent minds? Like, are we culturally competent with that? What's going on around us? What is our our space look like? Is that reflective of it? Gender specific, right? We're a girls and young women empowerment-based organization, so we have a women-led staff here to really respond to our girls and young women. Strength space, as I mentioned before, social justice oriented. We're very, very big on current events here. We have a current events group that keeps our girls and young women very much so aware of what's happening in society, what's happening in social movements, and how to advocate on behalf. When we would go to Albany and advocate for policy and wherever, we always bring girls with us so that they have that experience and that they have a voice and they're empowered for that. Also, in our intensive, we have a intensive youth leadership program over the summer, and throughout this program, our girls and young women are really discussing and delving into social justice issues, not just here in the U.S., but internationally. And when they graduate, they do a presentation on these huge issues, whether it's domestic trafficking or sex trafficking, but other issues that are going on, right, in other countries and here in the U.S. So really empowering and equipping them to do more than just the subpar services that we often think of putting on for survivors and victims. That is what I have for you all. I want to make sure I leave at least a couple more minutes for questions so I can answer anything else that you all have in mind.
Jenaya, thank you so much for all of this important information. We really do appreciate all of your work on behalf of survivors and victims of trafficking, and this information I think has been really helpful for everyone. We have some specific questions, and for the questions that we don't have time to get to today, we'll make sure that you get them, Jenaya, and might be able to follow up directly. And I know that you have offered to sort of be available for further trainings, and people can look at the GEMS website to get more information, and thank you for sharing that email and that website. One question that someone had asked is how they might get involved in doing policy work in their state. Is that something that you all do? Because I know that you're doing direct interventions and advocacy. What about somebody that might be interested in doing policy work?
That is something, I mean, like I said, we advocate for it. It's not anything that we do directly. I mean, we encourage everyone to involve in writing letters to their policymakers, being actively involved in there, but there are actual initiatives that are occurring in a lot of policy sectors and creating active policies regarding this. Right, when Safe Harbor was in the process of being passed, Rachel and girls were going back and forth to Albany advocating on that behalf and really, once again, educating and spreading that awareness and knowledge. So I would encourage to kind of look into what's going on in individual states and what movements, and like I said, right now in the movement, everyone is sex trafficking, and what can we do and how can we do it? So this is very prime time to kind of research and really look into ways that you can be a part of it, because it's really a movement. But like I said, it's only going to be a matter of time before this is not just a hot topic anymore, and then that's going to be a little bit more difficult. But I would use this to the advantage and try to see where you can actively participate in that.
Great, thank you. We had a question about some of the statistics that you were able to provide in the beginning. And I know if you had your sources and citations on that, so that's a great reference for folks that want to read more about specific statistics and research studies. But one of the questions is about that common age group of girls that is the highest sort of risk factor age, being the 12 to 14 age range. Do you have, in addition, any actual percentages or specific percentages of this age group getting into the commercial sex industry? Like what percentage of girls overall, I think, in that age group?
I do not. Okay, I know there's some. The statistics say things different, right? Why we picked the common age of entry versus the average age, because the average age was once, as I think as you saw in the Making of a Girl clip, was like 13. So really kind of like goes back to 7 and everything else. So just the common age of entry kind of gives a nice frame in a couple years in advance of kind of what can happen and with the recruitment process, I will look. I know we have more statistics that we're really fleshing out just to kind of determine if they're actually representative of what we're seeing across the nation, specifically concerning how many are 12, how many are 13, how many are 14. I can probably follow up with you to see if I can get those to you, and I'll,
Great.
whatever that is, we can have it. I can leave my email address and we can exchange information that way.
Excellent. Yes, and we will have the ability for folks that are wanting this. We will make the presentation available. There will also be a recording that you will be able to get. And if Jenaya has any other resources that she would like you all to provide, we can put that on the National Center for Victims of Crime website and point you all in the direction of more information, including on research, statistics, and also information on how to get involved with both your local anti-exploitation efforts and also kind of state and national policy efforts. So, Jenaya, thank you so very much for all of your information and your willingness to participate in this webinar with us today. People have your website information right there, and as I said, the presentation materials will be available very soon. Thank you all for participating today in this webinar. We do want to let you know that we will have another webinar that will be on October 7th, and registration will open soon. So please stay tuned to get more information on that at the next webinar, October 7th at 2 Eastern. So Jenaya, thank you so much, and thank you all for your participation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thank you all for participating. Look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you, Rebecca.
Bye.
Bye-bye.